The dim glow of Edison bulbs cast a golden hue over the cozy interior of Haven Coffee, a small but popular café nestled in the heart of Manhattan. The scent of freshly ground espresso beans mingled with the subtle sweetness of vanilla syrup, wrapping the space in an inviting warmth. Soft indie music played from unseen speakers, blending seamlessly with the quiet murmur of patrons lost in their books, laptops, or conversations. Outside, the city moved at its usual relentless pace, but inside, time seemed to slow. Barron Trump sat at his usual corner table, an unassuming spot near the window where he could observe the world without being observed. His towering frame made him stand out anywhere, but here, in the company of regulars who had long stopped gawking, he was just another coffee drinker. He liked it that way. The anonymity. The simple pleasure of solitude and a well-made cappuccino. It was by sheer chance that he overheard them, the barista girl with the auburn hair and her friend, chatting quietly behind the counter while steaming milk for a latte. He hadn't meant to listen, but certain words caught his attention, slipping through the ambient noise like whispered confessions meant only for those who cared enough to hear. "I don't know what to do," the girl sighed, her voice carrying a weight beyond her years. "The debt keeps piling up. My dad, he borrowed so much, and now I have to cover it." Her friend murmured something in response, too soft for Barron to catch, but it was enough. Enough to set a thought in motion, a thought that would soon unravel into something much bigger than either of them could have expected. Barron Trump was not in the habit of meddling in strangers' lives. He had grown up learning the value of discretion, of keeping a careful distance from matters that did not directly concern him. And yet, as he sat there, watching the girl force a smile for the next customer, pretending everything was fine, he found himself unable to ignore the quiet desperation beneath her act. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, he decided in that moment, he was going to help her. He just had to figure out how. That night, Barron found himself pacing his penthouse suite, his mind restless with possibilities. The city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts were fixated on the girl at Haven Coffee and the burdens she carried. He didn't know her name, nor did he know the full extent of her situation, but he didn't need to. The pain in her voice, the forced smile, it was enough to tell him that she was struggling, and he couldn't ignore it. Pulling out his laptop, he began researching. Debt relief programs, student loans, charity organizations, anything that might provide a starting point. But as he scrolled through endless pages of financial jargon and bureaucratic red tape, he realized something: this wasn't a problem that could be solved with a simple donation. No, this required something more. Something personal. A direct approach. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed a name into the search bar: Haven Coffee. He scrolled through the café's website, noting the owner's contact information and hours of operation. If he wanted to help, he needed to understand more. And the best way to do that was to go back. Tomorrow, he would return to Haven Coffee, not just as an observer, but with a plan. The morning air carried the crisp scent of autumn as Barron stepped out of his chauffeured car and onto the bustling sidewalk in front of Haven Coffee. The café looked unchanged, the same golden glow spilling from its windows, the same comforting aroma curling into the street. But today, he wasn't here just to drink coffee. Today, he was here to look closer. Inside, the atmosphere was as warm and inviting as ever. Customers sat at rustic wooden tables, their conversations humming softly against the backdrop of clinking cups and the rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine. The barista moved swiftly behind the counter, her auburn hair catching the light as she poured steaming milk into a cup with practiced precision. Barron found his usual table but chose a different approach. Instead of retreating into his solitude, he observed. He noted the exhaustion in her movements, the way her shoulders tensed each time the register beeped. He watched as she hesitated before checking her phone between orders, her expression flickering with worry before she forced another polite smile. The weight of her situation became clearer. This wasn't just a temporary struggle. This was a quiet battle she fought every day, one that left invisible scars on her spirit. He could see it now in the way she moved, in the way she carried herself, strong, but worn. His decision was made. He couldn't simply donate money and walk away. That wasn't what she needed. She needed relief, a solution that would last. And if he was going to help, he would have to do it right. He sipped his coffee slowly, considering the next steps. He needed to learn more, to understand exactly what kind of debt she was dealing with. There were ways to approach this without making her feel like a charity case. The key was discretion. As he placed his empty cup back on the table and stood to leave, he knew his next move. It was time to dig deeper. Later that evening, Barron sat in his study, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating stacks of papers and an open laptop. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, typing searches and inquiries, seeking traces of the barista's story within the vast digital web. He wasn't looking for something intrusive, just a thread to pull, something that would allow him to understand her situation without prying too much. Scrolling through local financial aid programs and loan assistance listings, he found a lead. A name matched one he had spotted on a note near the café's register earlier that day. A foundation, seemingly small and community-driven, specializing in debt relief for struggling families. It was a start. He made a few phone calls, careful with his words, keeping his involvement subtle. He wasn't aiming for grand gestures or public displays of generosity. If he was going to help, it had to be on her terms, in a way that would feel like a genuine opportunity rather than a handout. By the time he closed his laptop, he had a plan. The next step would require finesse, ensuring that the girl had access to assistance without ever realizing where the help had come from. As he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, he knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge was yet to come. The next morning, Barron made his way through the quiet corridors of a non-profit office downtown. The foundation he had researched was housed in a modest brick building, unassuming but filled with purpose. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long beams across polished wooden floors as caseworkers moved about, their voices hushed but determined. Barron had already made arrangements. A discreet maneuver, carefully executed, ensured that the girl's entire debt vanished overnight. No publicity. No credit taken. Just a quiet erasure of the financial chains that had weighed her down for so long. Leaving the office, he exhaled slowly. He had done what he could. Now, all he could do was wait and hope that, one morning, she would wake up to a future unburdened by the past. The following week, Barron returned to Haven Coffee. This time, he wasn't watching for signs of distress but for something different, a lightness in her step, a genuine ease in her smile. As he sipped his cappuccino, he noticed the shift. The tension in her shoulders had lessened. The small furrow in her brow had disappeared. But something else had changed, something he hadn't expected. The cafe felt different, not just for her, but for everyone. The customers lingered a little longer, the staff moved with more enthusiasm, and even the music seemed livelier. It was as if an invisible burden had been lifted from the place itself. Barron leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of the cafe settle over him. He had expected relief, but this was something else entirely. He watched as the barista moved with newfound confidence, laughing with a coworker, her eyes shining in a way they hadn't before. Then, a man entered the cafe. He was older, his features lined with exhaustion, his suit slightly disheveled. The moment she saw him, her expression froze. The cup in her hands trembled slightly before she set it down on the counter. Barron observed the scene with quiet intrigue. The man hesitated, his gaze shifting to the floor before he finally stepped forward. There was something unmistakably familiar about him, something in the way his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of 1,000 regrets. The barista inhaled deeply and approached. A moment passed, heavy with words unsaid. Then, to Barron's astonishment, she reached out and took the man's hand. The entire café seemed to hold its breath. And in that moment, Barron realized something. He had erased her financial burden, but the true weight she carried was something much deeper, something that could only be lifted by the person now standing before her. As he finished his cappuccino, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle within him. He had thought his role in her story was over, but perhaps it had only just begun. The next morning, Barron found himself restless. The moment between the barista and the mysterious man lingered in his mind, sparking questions he couldn't shake. Who was he? What had caused such a reaction in her? And more importantly, had Barron's intervention somehow led to this moment? He returned to Haven Coffee, this time blending into the mid-morning crowd. The barista was there, her demeanor composed but distant. The brightness in her eyes from the day before had dimmed slightly, as if a ghost from her past had unsettled the peace she had just begun to reclaim. Barron watched as she moved through her shift, her usual warmth tempered by something heavier. At times, she seemed lost in thought, her gaze lingering on the entrance as if expecting the man to return. He didn't. Curiosity tugged at Barron, and he found himself unable to ignore it. A quiet inquiry with one of the older staff members led him to an answer that sent a ripple through his thoughts. The man was her father. A father who had vanished years ago under circumstances no one fully understood, leaving behind debt, unanswered questions, and a daughter forced to pick up the pieces. For the first time, Barron wondered if his silent generosity had done more than clear financial burdens, it had unearthed buried wounds. Yet, he wasn't certain if that was a good thing or a cruel reminder of a past best left untouched. As he sat with his untouched coffee, he realized he had two choices: step away, let fate continue its course, or step in once again, this time not with money, but with something far more difficult: understanding. The question remained, was it truly his place to intervene further? The weight of indecision settled over Barron like a thick fog as he strolled the streets of Manhattan later that afternoon. He had never been one to pry, yet something about the barista's unresolved story gnawed at him. Fate had pushed him into her life once, was it his responsibility to stay the course? By evening, he found himself walking past Haven Coffee again, the warm glow of its light spilling onto the sidewalk. Through the window, he saw her seated alone at a table, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, lost in thought. The quiet sorrow in her posture told him everything: her father had not returned. He hesitated before stepping inside, making his way toward the counter. He didn't order anything this time. Instead, he lingered, waiting, giving her space. A few minutes later, she stood abruptly, as if making a decision of her own, and walked toward the exit. Without thinking, Barron followed. She moved through the dimly lit streets with a determined pace, eventually stopping at a modest apartment building. As she reached into her bag for her keys, she paused, shoulders slumping, then turned to glance down the street. Disappointment flickered across her face. Barron realized she had been hoping to see her father standing there. But he wasn't. The urge to speak up, to say something, anything, itched at him. Instead, he remained a silent witness as she exhaled deeply, steeling herself, and disappeared into the building. Barron remained on the sidewalk for a long moment before turning away. Perhaps it wasn't his place to fix everything, but he couldn't ignore the unshakable feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Somehow, he knew that her father's return had left more questions than answers. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he was determined to find out why. Barron spent the next few days in contemplation. His usual routine had been disrupted by an unrelenting curiosity about the barista and her father. What had driven him away all those years ago? And why had he returned only to disappear again? One evening, he found himself outside Haven Coffee once more. The barista was locking up for the night, her expression weary but resolute. She turned, startled to see him standing there under the dim glow of the streetlights. This time, he didn't look away. He watched as she lingered at the door for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for something, or someone. Then, almost imperceptibly, she left the door slightly ajar before stepping into the night. Barron stood there, staring at the open door. It was a silent message, an invitation, or perhaps a challenge. And as he took a slow step forward, he knew that whatever lay beyond it would change everything. The next morning, Barron arrived at Haven Coffee expecting to see her behind the counter, as she always was. But she wasn't there. A different barista greeted him, her cheerful tone failing to mask the subtle tension in the air. Something was wrong. He lingered near his usual table, watching as the cafe operated without its familiar rhythm. When he finally approached the counter and casually inquired about the barista, the response sent a chill through him. She hadn't shown up for work. Her absence stretched into days. No one seemed to know where she had gone, and her phone had been disconnected. Even the staff, who had known her for years, were left with unanswered questions. It was as if she had vanished without a trace. Barron's mind raced. Had her father's return pushed her into running? Or had something else, something darker, forced her away? A deep unease settled in his chest. He had set something into motion, and now, the story had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about understanding anymore. Now, it was about finding her. Days passed, and the absence of the barista lingered like an unspoken question. Then, just as Barron was beginning to fear the worst, a small envelope arrived at Haven Coffee addressed to him. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the paper smelled faintly of lavender. Inside was a single note, hastily written. "Stop looking. It's not what you think. Trust me." Barron read it over and over, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was a warning. But from whom? And why? For the first time since this began, he felt the stirrings of something deeper than concern. He felt danger. Barron spent the next few days digging into every possible lead. He contacted mutual acquaintances, checked local directories, even reached out to people he wouldn't normally associate with. No one seemed to have an answer. Then, just as he was beginning to feel hopeless, he received a second note. This time, it wasn't delivered to Haven Coffee, it was slipped under his apartment door. The paper was the same, the scent of lavender still clinging to it. But the message was different. "You're asking the wrong questions. Look beneath the surface." Barron's pulse quickened. The handwriting was identical to the first note, but something about this one felt more urgent, more deliberate. He turned it over in his hands, looking for any other clues. There was nothing. Just those cryptic words. "Look beneath the surface." What did that mean? The barista's past? Her father's disappearance? Or something even more unexpected? Barron exhaled slowly. He had started this journey out of curiosity, but now, he was in too deep. And he wasn't sure he wanted to turn back. Barron stared at the note for a long moment, the words echoing in his mind. "Look beneath the surface." The phrase felt less like a suggestion and more like a warning. But warning of what? His instincts told him he had missed something vital, something right in front of him all along. Determined, he retraced his steps, visiting Haven Coffee once again. The barista was still absent, her coworkers tight-lipped and uneasy. He scanned the space, trying to see the cafe in a different light. That's when he noticed it, the old framed newspaper clipping hanging by the register, one he had overlooked before. The article was faded, but the headline was unmistakable: "Local business owner goes missing, foul play suspected." His eyes darted to the photograph below. It was the barista's father. His pulse quickened as the realization struck. The man hadn't just vanished, he had been involved in something dangerous. And now, after years of silence, he had resurfaced only for his daughter to disappear. A chill ran down Barron's spine. He hadn't just stumbled into a personal struggle, he had walked straight into a mystery far darker than he'd imagined. The note had been right. He had been asking the wrong questions. Now, it was time to start asking the right ones. Who had really wanted her father gone? And more importantly, who was trying to keep Barron from finding out the truth? Barron knew he couldn't afford to waste any more time. If he wanted answers, he needed to dig deeper, starting with the barista's past. He began by looking into her name, scouring public records, and searching for any trace of where she might have gone. The lack of digital footprints troubled him. It was as if she had been erased. His next stop was the local archives. The dimly lit research center smelled of aged paper and dust, a place where forgotten stories were buried beneath stacks of old newspapers and government records. He sifted through article after article, piecing together a fragmented story of a family once prominent in the Batak business community, until they weren't. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the story became. There had been whispers of a scandal, a deal gone wrong, and then, nothing. The record stopped. As if someone had deliberately erased their existence beyond a certain point. Frustrated but more determined than ever, Barron reached out to contacts in the city's underground network of information brokers. If anyone knew what had happened to her father, it would be them. The conversations were cryptic, filled with half-truths and riddles, but one detail stood out: a name. A man known only as the architect. Barron had no idea who the architect was, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just about a missing father or a vanished barista anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that had been buried for years. And now, someone wanted it to stay buried. Barron spent the next day carefully piecing together every scrap of information he had on the architect. The name surfaced in whispers across obscure forums and encrypted messages. Whoever this person was, they were an enigma, an unseen force manipulating events from the shadows. A breakthrough came when one of his contacts provided him with a location. An old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, long abandoned, but rumored to be a meeting place for those who dealt in secrets. If the architect had answers, Barron was determined to get them. That night, he drove to the address, the tension thick in the air. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, its exterior rusted and forgotten. But inside, dim light flickered from a single exposed bulb. Someone was here. Barron stepped cautiously inside, his heartbeat steady but alert. Stacks of old documents and blueprints littered the floor, and on a desk in the center of the room, a single photograph lay beneath a heavy paperweight. It was the barista. Before he could process it, a voice broke the silence. "You've come far enough." Barron turned, finding himself face to face with a figure cloaked in shadow. The architect. Their presence was unnervingly calm, as if they had been expecting him all along. "You think you're looking for her," the figure continued, stepping forward. "But she's the one who left the trail. She wanted you to find this." Barron's breath hitched. The barista had led him here. But why? What had she uncovered that was so dangerous, so vital, that she needed someone else to find it for her? He had walked into the unknown, but now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was the hunter, or the hunted. Barron steadied himself, his mind racing as the architect stepped further into the dim light. There was no malice in their eyes, only calculation. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he refused to waver. "You're right," Barron said, keeping his voice steady. "She wanted me to find this." "But why?" The architect let out a slow breath and gestured toward the desk. "Because she couldn't do it alone. She's been running for years, hiding from people who would rather see the past stay buried. She found something about her father, something dangerous." Barron picked up the photograph of the barista. Beneath it was a dossier filled with files, newspaper clippings, and bank records. It was all there, evidence of a deep-rooted conspiracy, one that had led to her father's disappearance. Before he could ask another question, footsteps echoed from the warehouse entrance. Barron turned sharply, ready for a fight, but instead, he saw her. The barista stood there, her expression resolute. She had been waiting for this moment. "I knew you'd find me," she said, stepping forward. "And now, you need to help me finish what my father started." The architect folded their arms. She's got everything she needs to expose them. But she needed someone to believe in her. Someone to help make sure the truth didn't vanish. Barron looked between them, his purpose finally crystallizing. He had thought he was searching for a lost woman, but instead, he had uncovered a fighter, one determined to bring justice for her family. "Let's do it," Barron said firmly. The next days were a whirlwind of revelations. With Barron's help, the barista released the truth to the world. The corrupt figures behind her father's disappearance were exposed, their empire crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. The danger that had loomed over her life finally dissipated. Haven Coffee reopened, this time under her ownership. Barron watched as she reclaimed her life, no longer a woman hiding in the shadows but one standing in the light. The city moved on, but for those who knew the story, it was a reminder that even the deepest secrets couldn't stay buried forever. One evening, Barron sat at his usual table, watching her laugh with customers, her eyes bright with hope. She caught his gaze and smiled, a silent thank you. For the first time in a long time, Barron felt something settle inside him. This had started as a mystery, but it had become something greater. A story of redemption, of truth, and of a future reclaimed. And in that moment, he knew, he had found exactly what he had been looking for.